Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 234, season 5, episode 21. This week, we're going back to Beyond Sinai. After what I thought was a really great week and a great introduction to the idea of having conversations and discussions and interviews in the space of coaching the Bible, we're going back to what we were doing before in our progression through the second half of the book of Exodus, where we're looking at a framework and a structure of how one takes the people from the moment of Sinai and then forward. But a word about that conversation. I really appreciate the feedback and the comments from everybody who listened, who watched. I can tell you that from all the episodes that I've done over the last 4+ years, that episode had the largest viewership and the largest listenership. I don't get a massive audience in general, but I do want to appreciate that that's the case. And I want to thank Dr. Leitner for coming on and doing that with us. It was really illuminating conversation around the subject of the golden calf. There was much more that something just couldn't include in that hour-plus presentation. That said, it's definitely impetus and a trigger for the opportunity to do that again when it presents itself, hopefully, every few weeks or once a month, whatever it is, to bring people on who really can share perspective, who really have deep knowledge, who really understand at a very heavy and very deep level, and a very beautiful level, the different things that are going on in the Bible and the different stories and the different personalities and leaders that come across our vision and our lives to learn at a deep level. That was last week. But coming back to Beyond Sinai, structure that we had tried to put into place over the course of the second half of the book of Exodus, where we had shifted from the transformational moment at the revelation at Sinai, and we realized that something has to happen now. It can't always simply just be at Sinai. It has to move beyond Sinai. And so in the first week of this conversation, actually started many, many weeks ago, we talked about how Jethro had come along and it talked about establishing infrastructure and systems around the law and around the legality of the society. But beyond that, we then talked about how Moses was taking them from the blueprint to the breakthrough and structuring out the rest of the systems of governance that Moses was putting into play. And then we talked about fueling the mission and how Moses inspired the buy-in and the participation of other people. We learned that over the course of time, Moses built a beautiful hierarchy of leadership and engagement with the population at a very high level, which got incredible amount of buy-in and ownership from the people. But that said, we still need more. And that's where this week's session on wearing the weight comes into play. Because without clear leadership roles, the system risks collapse. And so here we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. How do you ensure that leadership isn't just effective in the moment, but that it's sustainable for the future? How do leaders embody their responsibility in a way that commands trust, that it ensures accountability, and that it really reinforces the mission's integrity? And then how do leaders ensure the mission outlasts the individuals leading it? We don't want it to simply be one generation. This has to be multi-generational. It has to be historical. It has to go on and on and on, which tells us why this idea about wearing the weight is the critical next step. And that idea of wearing the weight is the idea of the conversation around the priestly garments that appears in the second half of the book of Exodus. There's a whole long conversation that needs to be had and should be had about who should be the priests, who should be the high priest. We dipped a toe into the conversation last week when we talked about Aaron's role in the golden calf experience and perhaps the surprise that he's the one who's selected and chosen. But it's important to appreciate, leaving that part aside, that there's a role here that has to be played, and that role is going to be played by someone other than Moses, that we're going to split on some level the spiritual leadership from the political leadership, and we're going to split the worship that's going to take place in the tabernacle in the temple from the role of teacher, educator, leader. And that's really important to appreciate. And they'll understand then that what we have in the conversation that's brought into being around the priestly garments, that it's not just about priestly garments and therefore it's inaccessible and doesn't mean anything to the average person or to the average leader. We have to appreciate what's going on now is that we're shifting from simply being a charismatic, personality-driven type of leadership into something that's much more institutionalized, much more structured, much more formal. The high priest doesn't just carry that responsibility personally, he becomes a symbol of the collective accountability. He's going to own it. He's going to wear it for all time. The garments then reinforce that the leaders really don't just hold office. You're not just in a position. It carries weight, and it carries the weight of the people and their trust and their future. And so wearing the weight, this conversation is about how leaders step into their role in a way that says, I'm accountable for those I lead. I represent something larger than myself. And the mission depends on how I show up and what I symbolize. And we talked about showing up in this conversation a couple of years ago in Coaching the Bible. We talked about the entrance of the high priest with certain garments and the idea that there are certain bells at the bottom that announce his presence. We're not going to go into that detail of it, but that's what we're talking about here. The high priest's garments and the priest's garments symbolize the nation's values, the nation's mission, and the nation's vision. And what they wear and what they say and how they carry themselves impacts their ability to inspire and to lead. And so without actual clear leadership identification and accountability, the reality of all movements is that the movements will lose momentum, the teams will lose trust, and the missions will stall because it doesn't persist. It doesn't have that sense of how it goes on. It doesn't have the institutionalization. And what often happens is that you have a diffusion of accountability because there's nobody who's actually officially accountable. There's no one actually officially who's in charge. You can't look at a person and say, okay, he or she is the leader here. And because you can't, no one takes ownership, no one takes responsibility, and it falls. And so we're going to talk about really 4 leadership principles that relate to identity, symbols, and responsibility. And in exploring these 4 principles that relate to that, I think we're going to get a really good understanding of why this is a key and important and next piece in the puzzle in the process of building out Beyond Sinai. So principle number 1 is going to be leadership as a visible identity, how presence shapes perception. Number 2, leadership as accountability, carrying the burden for those you lead. Principle number 3 is going to be leadership as an emotional presence, how empathy builds trust. That's really important. And number 4, leadership as focus, how clarity protects against distraction. We'll talk about that as well. So number 1 here is leadership as a visible identity, the symbolism of the priestly garments. Again, what's going on here is we're not just building the building. We're not just building the temple/tabernacle, which we talked about at length over the first couple of weeks. Here we're moving into another aspect of it, which is running parallel to it, which is the priestly garment conversation. So the key insight first here with respect to the high priest garments is that they symbolize the leaders who are not just individuals, but rather that they represent the mission itself. The garments signal trustworthiness, authority, and credibility. And what we have to appreciate is that every aspect and every detail was purposeful. Nothing appeared on the body of a priest or a high priest that did not belong. And so the garments are symbols. You have to wear it well. You have to wear it. To appreciate that you can't just show up in, a t-shirt and shorts and be the high priest. It simply doesn't work. And so there's power in symbols. There's something that's called the halo effect, which was coined in the 1920s. The idea by someone by the name of Professor Thorndike. What happens is this. The halo effect is this. People instinctively judge leaders based on external cues like attire and posture and presence. And leaders who present themselves with a certain level of confidence and clarity and intentional presence are perceived, whether they are or they aren't, leave that for a moment, but they're perceived as more competent even before they speak. They're announcing something about themselves even before they actually say anything whatsoever. Think about how much harder it is for a person to garner and gain that level of trust and believability and confidence from an audience if they show up, in soiled garments, if they show up covered head to toe in mud. It doesn't work. And so there's something very important about this idea of a halo effect that comes into play. There's also something else by the name of Amy Cuddy put into play called the power posing theory, which I really love the language of it. The power posing theory is leaders who physically step into their role through confident posture and assertive body language and purposeful presence influence both how others perceive them and how they perceive themselves. And so there's a level of seriousness that a person takes about themselves in this way. I remember years ago, 2008, I was a pretty young guy, actually, 2008, 17 years ago. And I was moving into a new role as a leader in a nonprofit organization, but I was fairly young. And most of the people I was dealing with were older than me by a good number of years, other teams, other organizations, other leaders. And my team itself was also fairly young. And so we made a conscious effort that we would always dress up whenever we showed up anywhere. We'd always wear a suit, male and female. We always dress very formal so that people would take us seriously and so that we would take ourselves seriously in those spaces, in those moments. There's a certain composure, a certain demeanor that came with it when we walked into a room looking a certain way. Our youthfulness and our age became less of a factor because we looked a certain way. We would do the same thing where we would take our laptops out and open them up exactly the same way. And that engendered a certain vibe and a certain energy and a certain perception of influence and assertiveness that we wanted to present. You could take real world leaders who appear a certain way when they walk into a room, certain severity perhaps that they take, a certain composure that they have. They talk about Howard Schultz, we may mention again later on, Howard Schultz, who's the former CEO of Starbucks, that he would dress up in a crisp white shirt and a tie whenever he went to visit the Starbucks locations, because he wanted people to appreciate that he took it seriously and that it was a premium coffee experience, and they should take it the same way. A couple of years ago, when I was working at Cosmatch at the company, I used to run the annual planning meetings. And one year, when I came to the annual planning meeting, I came wearing a tie. Never wore a tie. It wasn't a formal environment like that, but I wore a tie to the annual planning meeting, at least the first day of it, because I wanted to share and show a certain level of severity and seriousness that was needed to have in the conversation that was taking place that day. There's also a story about Mark Zuckerberg that is 1 year in the company, I forget how many years ago it was, is there, how important the purpose and mission was in that space. And so that's the leader, as it were, as it relates to the high priest. You can imagine seeing the high priest walk into the room. You can imagine seeing the regular priest upon your entry into the tabernacle, to the temple, whatever it is your faith, when you walk into a place of worship, you see the person who represents the faith there, dressed in a certain garb, looking a certain way. It imparts a certain sense, hopefully, calm and composure, but also solemnity and seriousness and spirituality that you're trying to get across. So here's the action step for you as the leader. Number one, do what I would call a presence audit. Ask yourself, what does my presence communicate, whatever room I walk into, before I even open up my mouth? This is hard to do because you're self-evaluating, and that's always hard to do. But if you're willing and able to take a very honest look at yourself, can you do that? It's always a big issue, just as an example from the modern day. It's a senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Fetterman, who walks around in a sweatshirt and shorts. And when he does something, it's always surprising. When he outperforms, he's always outperforming because he looks like he just came out of the gym. That's not to deny or to diminish how he comports himself and how he holds himself, and certainly as it relates to me personally, how he views and how he stands on the subject of Israel. He happens to be in Israel, I think, this week. But I wonder out loud about how it might be different if he perhaps aligned his appearance with his mission. I don't know. I wonder about that. So you can do the same thing. Does my visual identity, how I show up, match the message that I'm trying to make? It could be. It could be that it's not. That's number one. So first thing here is the symbolism around it, is the idea here of leadership as a visible identity, the symbolism of the priestly garment. Number two, after that, is the idea of accountability as it relates to the manner in which I show up and how I wear the weight. And so it was the case that the high priest would wear the names of the tribes on his shoulders. He literally carried the names of the tribes on his shoulders, which is a reminder that the leadership that he held is about serving others, and it's not about personal status. It's a really important and really crucial, vital understanding of what the role is. The role of the leader, we've talked a lot about servant leadership, isn't that it's accrues greatness to the leader because of who the leader is. It is something that relates to the burden and the privilege of leadership that comes to the idea of what we talked about, which is servant leadership. Servant leadership we talked about. Servant leadership is about prioritizing the well-being and growth of the other, of the team, of the community, of the family. Leadership is an act of service rather than an act of personal gain. And so you have to appreciate that there's this beautiful concept that is the burden of leadership. Literally the case with the high priest, that he was carrying the burden of the people on his shoulders. You have to appreciate that that's the case here. So really great example of this was a gentleman by the name of Alan Mulally. Alan Mulally was the CEO of Ford after Ford was about to post a $17 billion loss. And he instituted something called the red, yellow, and green system. If you're thinking red, yellow, green from the traffic light, you got it. The idea basically was that when directors of teams would present to the group about what was going on in their work, they had to show up as either red, yellow, or green. If it was going green, it meant that it was going really, really well. If it was yellow, it meant that they were still on track, but there were some hitches in the road. If it was red, that meant it was basically off track and it really needed help. In his first meeting, he showed up and everyone presented everything is green. And he said to them, it can't be that everything is green if we're about to post a $17 billion loss. It was simply that they were either embarrassed or uncomfortable or afraid of sharing where the glitches and the problems and the bottlenecks were. As it progressed, it began to be the case by week 3, finally somebody had said that we actually have a problem. He stood up and applauded. This is the commitment to resolving critical issues, but this is the commitment to the idea of accountability. He is accountable as the CEO. The directors are accountable for their teams. We talked about in last week's episode the idea that Moses is accountable to God for his team being the people of Israel. And when they mess up, as we said that they talked about the idea that they messed up in the story of the golden calf, then he is accountable and he is responsible for their behavior, even though he wasn't there when it happened. That's part 2. That's principle number 2 here. And so you have to ask yourself, leader, who are the names that are on your shoulders? Who are you carrying? Whose weight are you wearing? Who are you responsible for? If you have more people on your team than you're wearing on your shoulders, then you have a disconnect. And it's important to try to reconcile that. You have to then own the challenges. Can you and have you, when was the last time that you did take responsibility when things go wrong? Even if you didn't do it, it's your team, it's someone who reports to you, and they made a blunder or whatever it is, and so you're owning it even though you didn't do it. And on the flip side of that, relatedly, is championing those people, thank you, when they do something right and appreciate their value and that they're supported and that they're important and that you see the impact that they're having. So that's number 2. So again, first was the idea of the symbol of the priestly garments, really important, that idea of the halo effect, what it shows about my presence. Number 2 is the idea of the names that I'm sharing, that I'm wearing, that I'm carrying on my shoulders, the accountability factor. And number 3, moving into the next one, is the idea of the emotional presence. This is the idea of the empathy role that comes into the leadership space. And it's represented here in the garment that the high priest would wear on his chest, the breastplate that he would wear on his chest, in Hebrew called the Choshen Mishpat. The breastplate symbolized that the high priest carried the people's struggles, their needs, and their aspirations on his heart. This was not just symbolic. It conveyed that the leader must hold the emotional pulse of the people close, and that his or her decisions must be made both with wisdom and, importantly, Empathy. Empathy I talk about a lot because I don't think I'm particularly good at the empathy thing, but it's something that I work on all the time. It's really crucial that the leader lead with empathy, and that it's not just X's and O's, zeros and ones, and now we have to move the next piece. That there's a human element here, there's an emotional element here, and the team needs to feel that the leader has that and senses it, and the leader needs to portray and to show that that's actually true. And when there's what's called an empathy gap, you have a real problem. The empathy gap is that there's space between where the leader actually is on the empathy chart and where the team actually is on the empathy chart, and that the leader has to constantly be monitoring where that is and trying to fill that gap to make sure that they're actively engaged, they're actively on top of the emotional landscape and the emotional space of the people that they are responsible for. That's both in the spoken way and in the unspoken way. So things that are actually being said out loud and the things that people are feeling that aren't being said out loud. You can imagine a team during the first periods of a recession or a pandemic, and the things that people aren't saying out loud about how they're feeling, what they're going through. The leader has to be able to pick up those pieces and appreciate it and lead with empathy in those spaces. But that's this idea here of sensing it as an emotional presence in leadership. Can you do that? Are you doing that? Is that something that's going on? So I mentioned before Howard Schultz. I'll mention him again. Howard Schultz also had what was called a partnership approach at Starbucks. By consistently referring to employees as partners, Schultz created a culture where the staff felt personally invested in the customer experience, reinforcing that what he was trying to build was not just a business, but a relationship-driven community, right? That is in the space of the emotional side of the work. You want to get the buy-in. We talked last time about buy-in. You get buy-in by talking about the people and talking to the people in a way in which they feel like it's people first, it's culture first. It's not about just bottom line. It's about human beings. It's appreciating those things. When you view these people as your partners, it's a different experience altogether. Remember also, there was a synagogue that I dealt with many years ago that didn't have members. They only had partners, meaning that when a person signed up to join the synagogue, they joined as a partner, not as a member. And I asked the leadership why that was. And they said, yes, it's just simply a difference in terminology, but the impact was great because we treat things differently when we're partners than we do when we're simply just members. I'm a partner, I'm a partial owner of every molecule, every seat, every wall, every piece of the institution. And so I take it more seriously and I appreciate it differently than if I'm quote unquote just a member. And I will take the emotional toll of my partners at a much higher level and to a much greater degree than I would if, quote unquote, they're just members. So we have to create the right spaces. We have to validate people's contributions. We have to cultivate a certain level of support and safety and openness and tone that is without fear, without blame, so that everyone senses that they belong to the emotional pulse of this team. Ask yourself that question. Do I understand the emotional pulse of this team? Am I fostering and engendering and creating a space that is emotionally connective throughout my team? Those are hard questions to ask, but they're important. And the last one, I know I'm going very long today. Thank you. Appreciate you for staying with me here into minute 26. The last one here, principle number 4, is leadership as focus. So if we talked about the breastplate before, let's talk about the gold plate, what's called the tzitz in Hebrew. That was a golden plate that was worn by the high priest on his forehead and was engraved with the words, "Holy to the Lord." Because it was positioned exactly where it was positioned on the forehead, it is effectively the seat of consciousness for the high priest. This represented and was responsible and forced a level of mental clarity, focus, and purpose-driven leadership. It's on your head at every moment, at every point. It's to be remembered. It's to be thought about. It's to help focus and to drive in a certain direction. It helps to maintain a certain level of discipline and a certain level of focus for the leader and everybody else. And it's really crucial that the leader is able to build that into the system for everybody else. So if I'm wearing it on my forehead or I'm wearing it on my sleeve or whatever it is, I'm bringing it to everybody else. Can I create that environment where focus and intentionality is there for everyone on the team? There's this thing called the one thing theory, put out there by a gentleman by the name of Gary Keller. And Keller's research demonstrates that the most effective leaders achieve success by ruthlessly prioritizing the most impactful tasks. Ask yourself, what is the one thing I can do today that will make everything else easier or even unnecessary going into the future? Have everyone on the team focus on the one thing. What's the one thing that we're talking about today, that we're working on today, that we're focusing on today? Is it marketing? Is it audience? Is it messaging? Is it numbers? Is it planning? Whatever it's going to be that fosters and pushes a high level of focus. When you do that, you get much further. So the great example of that was Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he reduced what Apple was working on to 10 things, 10 core products in the first year. And by focusing Apple's energy on fewer projects, Jobs amplified what the innovation and the transformation that was possible in the company, and then it showed. And so there's a relentless focus on a very small number of very important things that helps to create and engender the success that you're looking for. Spread that over a nation, and you create an incredible level of depth and focus, intentionality, and ultimately success. And so ask yourself as the leader, what's the one action that will deliver the greatest impact today? And then ask yourself that question tomorrow. And if you're looking at planning, you can ask yourself, what's the one thing that we can really relentlessly focus on for the next quarter that's really going to push us forward as much as possible? And am I focused on it? And am I distracted by less important things? And is the team aligned and congruent and focused on our highest ideals and our highest goals and our highest success? And if not, why not? And what can I do about it? And so as a result of this, what you have is this very powerful structure that's put into place through the prism of the high priest. And this sacred responsibility that the high priest and the priestly community brings to the people. And so after having established the idea that we have a political structure in place through the prism of the court system and the tribal leaders, and that we have a physical space in the idea of a tabernacle temple, in Hebrew the term is the Mishkan, in the desert, and ultimately then the temple in Jerusalem. And then the third thing that we talked about was the idea of the buy-in from the people. We're now talking about a heavy level of accountability, responsibility to the individual, to the location, to the team, to the community, to the mission that's out there. And so what ends up happening is that you now have a person that embodies the presence that's necessary for leadership, that is accountable, that shows the emotional investment that's necessary for this to work for him as the leader, but for everybody else as well. And then creating the space for the focus that ensures that the mission becomes and remains clear and undistracted. And so the garments play that role. The person plays that role. And so he's wearing it on his forehead, on his shoulders, on his heart, but it's also in every fiber of his being. And you appreciate that what's going on here isn't just simply about clothing. This is really leadership at the highest level. It's not any longer just about what you do, but it's very much about who you represent and what it is that you represent. So the true weight of leadership is that the leader carries the weight of their team's trust, that the leader carries the weight of their organization's values, that the leader carries the weight of the community's future. And that's what separates those who hold power, because there's a lot of people who have power, from those who bear responsibility. But true leadership isn't just about carrying tasks or responsibilities. It's about carrying people. It's about carrying their doubts and their fears and their failures. And all of it lives on your shoulders and on your heart. But it's also carrying their dreams and their future and their optimism and their vision and their goals and their success and bringing all those things to bear. And leadership, ultimately, as we finish this out, is not about standing above others. It's about standing beneath them and carrying their weight with purpose and conviction. The high priest didn't wear his title. He wore his people. He didn't carry status. He carried their stories, their struggles, and their hopes. And he didn't just lead in the moment. He carried their vision of the future. That is what it means to wear the weight. So here's the final thought from an unknown quote. I'm not even sure it's actually a quote, but I really liked it. The weight of leadership isn't a burden, it's a privilege. And it's only heavy because it matters. That is Coaching the Bible for this week. As always, thank you so much for paying attention, staying with me, and being with me. If you have any comments, ideas, thoughts, guests, whatever it is that you want to bring it, I'm happy to hear it. I want to know about it. I want to learn about it. Thanks so much for listening. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Look forward to seeing you next week.